Any company that says we have special connections to a school is lying. Firstly, because if you have special connections to a school, you would never tell people. There's no chance that happens.
When I tell people we don't have essay specialists the way that a lot of other companies do, they're shocked.
You guys know that the way that these companies market themselves is wild, and it is the Wild West out there when it comes to numbers. It's crazy to how they blow up case studies to try to lure families in.
In general, not to be too blunt with it, but admissions consulting can be a shady industry. There are an ample number of bad actors in this space. And I think that there's several reasons why that's the case. Part of it is just that it's lucrative. These kinds of services require a lot of one-on-one work with very qualified people with fancy credentials. So there's kind of money on that on the one side. I think more importantly, though, these services in general are non-falsifiable, which is to say that if you work with somebody and they get into Harvard, is it because of you? And if they get rejected, is it your fault? Hard to tell in both cases. And so for that reason, it's actually fairly hard from a consumer perspective or a parent perspective to differentiate between good companies and bad. There also is the issue of companies that select for top students. A lot of companies will provide huge discounts for students who are already excellent, who are going to get into a great school no matter what, and then claim credit for those accomplishments. So there's significant selection bias. On top of that, you have the fact that admissions is incredibly opaque, not just that it is opaque in the sense of there being a holistic admissions process in which there's simultaneously an infinite number of variables and none at all, but also opaque in the sense that people can make claims around having personal connections to this school or that school that ostensibly would benefit you. I'll give you a sneak peek into that particular point. They're all lying. There's no such thing in the admissions process unless who you're talking to is the president of the university or a member of the board of trustees. And even then, probably not going to benefit you. Beyond that as well, this is an industry where most often families will work with a company once and never again. So there isn't exactly repeat customers. And so for that reason, companies are not as strongly disincentivized from certain kinds of business practices that would probably compromise repeat business, but that are beneficial in securing business the first time. Let's call them exaggerations and things of that sort. And also, it's just easy to produce results that don't actually mean anything. Things like saying, okay, X number of our students got into Ivy League schools. That sounds good, but how many students did you work with? And how many did you hand select? And what did those students look like before you started working with them? All right, just giving you that raw number doesn't tell you anything. And that's how this industry, generally speaking, has marketed its efficacy. To me, those statistics are generally pretty meaningless. In general, just to summarize, it's just in this industry in particular, where you're dealing with families and students who are sometimes feeling very desperate, incredibly anxious, it's extremely hard for people to evaluate the quality of a company or the quality of a service ex ante. So today, what we're going to talk about is how to actually separate the good from the bad, how to recognize good companies, bad companies, et cetera. We'll start with the bad. I wanted to start with Erin. What do you think are some of the telltale signs of a bad counseling company? What things should parents look for?
When parents hear there's any kind of guarantees to the admissions process or results in any kind of way, I think you should pay extra attention. There are probably going to be extra terms, and it's never what it seems like or it sounds like, those kind of guarantees. There used to be, I think, a competitor in the international space where they were making these guarantees or maybe even like bets against families to say, I can get your student to X, Y, and Z school. And if it does happen, you pay me extra money for it, right? And if it doesn't happen, then you don't pay me extra. And basically what they were doing was like hand selecting for students and then looking for the ones that will have a better chance and then trying to take bets on those students' chances. And if one of those students get in, they're going to get paid a big payout, and that would sustain that business for that particular year. And those are not the kind of businesses or counseling companies you'd want to get involved in. They're just with Varsity Blue and all the scandals. A lot of students and families that come to us say that's one of the bigger reasons that they are being very careful and selective is that they don't want their children and their family to be involved in something like that.
I remember which company you're talking about. They've gone out of business in the interim.
Oh, yes.
But basically,
Thank goodness.
It was using like scatter plot data. to calculate the probability that a student would get into a certain set of schools. And then it was like, okay, you pay me $50,000, and if you don't get in, I'll give you a $30,000 refund. And then did basically nothing for the student, nothing of value, but said that they were. And then half the students got in, maybe they kept the 50,000 because they had bet correctly. The other half, they refunded the 20,000 or the 30,000.
Wow.
So they still pocketed $20,000 from all the students. There are probably 3 or 4 relatively famous companies in the space currently doing that in some fashion.
I hate to jump in here, guys, but it's something that we haven't added to our agenda, or something that I'm sure we need to just name, is the fact that none of this is regulated. And I'm listening to both of you. And of course, I'm an ingenious employee. I know this space, but at the same time, I've got goosebumps from all of these stories. And I really don't know to what extent people know about these types of issues that, for you guys, of course, you know what's going on with your competitors, but it's not a good situation for families to be entering into.
Definitely agree. I think that to some extent is the product of the fact that these services can be extremely valuable, but universities, for the most part, have distanced themselves from it more than they've distanced themselves from like test prep, for example. And so for that reason, it's almost a little bit of an underground industry. I think that's changed a lot in the last 10 years, but I do think it had the effect of creating a lot of bad actors who were free to act badly. We're all parents. Just thinking about it from that perspective of, if we didn't really know what we were doing, it's exceptionally easy to get caught up in a bad actor's scheme. Erin, what are some of the other things that you think we should be looking for other than guarantees?
You already mentioned this as well previously, like some kind of special connection to certain schools. That certainly doesn't really play, especially at the college level, with the additional scrutiny from the public now in terms of the admissions at these highly selective institutions. They're going to be extra careful about any kind of relationship. And we know from admissions officers, and we also know from sort of people who might actually have these connections to presidents, oftentimes they're asking us, is it going to be a liability? Are these things that I really should not leverage at all or use or mention, because it's actually going to tank my chances rather than help me? So for any company to say, because we know science, that means your student is going to have a leg up, that's just not the case. No, not a scenario and at all. So definitely be careful about those things. And then the other thing that I would say is, what can the company bring to the table? What kind of resources can they provide? What kind of expertise? What kind of data are they using? What kind of information are they keeping up with what's happening in admissions these days? Things are changing very quickly for higher education. But also, it's one thing to paint a pathway to say, hey, like, you need this kind of AP classes, you should get straight A's, or research opportunities, or you need to start your own club, but they actually can't help you with those, right? I think that is differentiator between a company that is actually providing value and helpful and helping you to achieve the goals, versus just saying this is what you need to do and like you're left on your own.
Yeah, I think I remember around the time that you started, we had the admissions officers and they were providing the overarching strategy for students, and I think that the inclusion of admissions officers in a company is actually pretty important. Somebody who gets into Cornell does not necessarily know why they get in or why other people don't. So I think that the admissions officers component is important, and the company ultimately that you look for should have them. But I remember in the beginning, we had this issue where, this is like 2016, we'd come up with these incredibly elaborate and specific strategies for students, but students just weren't executing on those strategies. They just didn't have the resources. And it took us years to build out internships and research opportunities and the startup incubator and all these other things. It came down to the fact that strategy without execution isn't worth much, and vice versa. And so you need both. I remember talking with a family in Beijing recently, but they're like, oh, we're choosing between Ingenious and this other company. And this other company says they have like basically all the same resources. We're not a small company. We're pretty global. I looked up the company. It's a 3-person company. And it's like, they're saying, oh yeah, we start a big incubator and we have research with hundreds of professors. It's obviously nonsense, but I think there's the added issue of a lot of companies can stretch the truth on that during a sales process, which I'm not sure there's a good solution for other than maybe LinkedIn.
I was also with a family recently. They were trying to decide whether or not they were going to pursue graduate coaching with Ingenious or with a different company. And they asked me, how do you stay abreast of what's going on in college admissions? And I thought that was a wonderful takeaway that any parent can implement immediately in their search process. Because if somebody's not reading the Wall Street Journal, if somebody's not reading in this space, if they're not following blogs, if they're not engaging in podcasts like this, even as a graduate coach, then what are they doing? And Ingenious not only has obviously our proprietary curriculum, but for sure it's a group of learners. That's something that has been clear to me from the beginning. People are they're reading, they're learning, they're pursuing new projects like this, and it's a great culture to be around.
Yeah, we take a lot of pride in that. When we work with students, we want to be inspiring them and we want to be role models. And so I think it means that holding ourselves to higher standards as well, too.
I think it's also a cultural thing as well, which is like there are a lot of companies in this space where like their branding and their sort of public image is around fame, excess, designer, this and that, luxury goods. And it's just like, this is an education company and this is it's in the education industry. If your orientation in terms of culture is not highly intellectual and academic, you're probably doing it wrong. Aaron, what do you think about in terms of the types of counselors or the types of consultants that companies use? What do you think differentiates bad company from a good company?
Yeah, I think I've seen companies, they send off me students into these top schools and they want to hire some of them back. And sometimes you are left with those students while they're still in college. We were all once college students and we know what the college student life was like. Even the most responsible ones had term papers and things get busy. It's really difficult for them to commit to the level of attention and effort that a family and a student deserves in this process. So anybody that sort of has those people playing any kind of implementation roles or anything other than maybe an occasional call to give you like a different perspective and for networking purposes is really not serving the student really well in terms of just the level of effort that would be required in this process. Anybody that sort of uses vast majority of their team or counselors who are not full-time or fully dedicated to this work and have a lot of other obligations, definitely be careful of those too.
Erin, I think these points are so important. I just always go back to the question, how would you choose a school for your child? Would you want exclusively contract labor? Would you want college students teaching your child high school? If not, then why are you making different choices when it comes to this bridge between high school and college? I know it's not a regulated place the way that schools are. How would you evaluate a school? If you have a different standard, you might want to ask yourself why.
I would say, again, not mentioning any names, there are a few companies, larger organizations that use a very wide network of current college students who are contractors. The problems with them are myriad. They are unreliable, as most college students are. They quit abruptly. They don't necessarily have the professionalism or the knowledge necessary to help students. I've also seen instances in which companies obfuscate the fact that a lot of the work is being done by these individuals. They'll say, okay, there's this person and this person's full-time. And what they don't tell you is that person meets with you like every month or 2 months. But the vast majority of the work in between is being done by this sort of army of like much, much lower paid college student contractors. And so I guess my tip for that is I would ask very clearly for a list of who are all of the people that I'm going to interact with. I want to know. Don't give me one person who only does a tenth of the work. Like I want to know who is actually doing the work, because I've had a number of families who come to me from some of these companies and they're very unhappy. And one of the things they say is, listen, I signed up because there was this senior person that I was working with, but I thought that's who I was working with. I didn't realize that I meet this person 3 times a year. And otherwise it's Dennis from Duke University, who's like a sophomore and pledging a fraternity. That just doesn't work.
Okay, Dennis.
Or Dennis.
We all know Dennis.
Yes.
Dennis has no time. I don't remember if this is the case, but I suspect at some point very early in the company, when we were closer to college age, we tried to use college students and it just did not work. Just so unreliable. Their schedules are so variable. So that's just not something that parents should be paying a premium for. You do not want to be working with people like that. So I would be very clear and ask a full list of who you're working with. Aaron, I don't know how many companies are doing this now, but it was popular for a while, the sort of assembly line approach to missions consulting, where it's
Yeah.
this
I
person does
think
this,
a lot of people are still doing that because when I tell people we don't have essay specialists the way that a lot of other companies do, they're shocked or they're surprised that we don't farm out that work to somebody else who doesn't know the student. We say that the team that you work with, they're the ones helping you with your story because they know you the best and they are able to help you figure out the best story to present in whether it's personal statement or your supplemental essays. The families are always surprised and they say, oh, like I thought that you would have an essay specialist who would come in that space and do the essay editing. So there definitely this assembly line model where you talk to one person about your school list and then you talk to somebody else about your major strategy and then you talk to somebody else about your essays, and the person that's giving you essay edits maybe never met you and just working on written feedback only. I would say again, Joel's question about asking all the people who will be doing the work on that team is going to be really important, and asking about who's going to be doing the essay editing, who's going to be reviewing the materials before you hit the submission button, who's going to be the one to answer your questions when those come out, making sure you really understand who those people are going to be.
The assembly line approach can be really seductive to parents because there is a lot of output. Like you can see on the paper what it is that this essay has received in terms of criticisms, or for the activities list, or for the resume, et cetera, school list. You can see all of those red lines that the specialist enacted on that document. But something that I hope that parents take away or students take away from this podcast is that it's the difference between having these like red lines on your paper that focus mostly on grammar or word count, or receiving edits that are helping you have a better essay because the person knows you as an individual. I know every person at Ingenious works with students, and some of the students I'm working with right now, when this student first came to me at the beginning of the year, he had a list of different essay options that he thought might be good. But over the course of a couple of meetings, after getting to know him better and better, I was able to ask more and more questions, and we got to a completely different type of personal statement by the end of it. Obviously, that's just one small anecdote. I know it doesn't prove anything, but it does matter getting substantive feedback as opposed to just word count, cut this, move, tighten this, whatever. The assembly line model may look like you're receiving a lot of feedback, but that doesn't mean it's high quality.
I agree with that completely. I think that the allure is that from a family's perspective is the company can say, this means that we have really the best experts for each thing. I think one of the things that families have to understand is that's not why companies do that. The reason that companies do assembly line is twofold. One is that it saves money because you can have people specializing things and do way more of it, so a much higher volume. The more important reason that companies do it is because they're experiencing a lot of counselor churn. I know of competitors and companies that are experiencing 30, 40% of their counseling team churning every year. That's huge. In education industry, it's like teacher churn is not unusual, but at that degree, it's massive. It means that there are students who are going through 4 or 5 counselor transitions, which is not the end of the world, but it's also not ideal. It doesn't look very good either from the company's perspective. If you have a lot of cooks in the kitchen and there's no one person that's your primary person, it doesn't matter if people quit because the family might not even notice. So oftentimes it's because they can't retain counselors that they're doing it. The analog I think that I go back to most often is this is very high-end service industry. It's very specialized. It's not in that way all that dissimilar from legal services. There's obviously important differences, but if you're hiring a law firm for a bet the firm litigation, and the team that did discovery was completely distinct from the team that did pre-trial motions, was completely distinct from the team that actually argued in court, and there was no consistency throughout that process, you wouldn't get the best of everything. What you would get is a lot of balls dropped in between transitions from team to team, which is exactly what happens in the assembly line model, is that students end up just repeating themselves time and again because it's not actually a kind of a steady flow through. These are complex high-end services. That model just does not work. It is cost effective. Some companies have so many counselor transitions that the assembly line model is a necessity. Otherwise, every student would be going through half a dozen over the course of several years.
This also ties to maybe the fact that admissions is holistic, right? You can't really just have one person that works on your personal statement. Something we noticed very early on is that you need a whole application with your supplemental essays and even those little boxes you have to fill in the Common App. Every little single piece has to pull together and make it make sense. And so if you have anybody that's working just on a piece of it, what you end up with is a big picture that doesn't make sense when you put it all together. And that is what admissions officers are getting. So why would you want that kind of approach to your application materials, to your whole entire process, right? You would want somebody who's been there with you the whole time and understands all of the context that you bring to the table and make sure that there's consistency across all of your experiences.
One thing I would probably add to things to be wary of, I would generally be wary of any company that's a cult of personality. I'm not sure if this is tooting our own horn or insulting myself, but Ingenious is one of the larger companies in this industry. We're in 15 countries. We've worked with thousands and thousands of students. Most people don't know me. It's not the Joel Butterly consulting company. There are some companies where the identity of the founder and the company are basically inextricably linked. The problem with that model is that as the company grows, families are signing up to work with directly or tangentially with the founder. And 9 times out of 10, what ends up happening is you don't, or you get a tiny amount of attention that's really not worth it. The value of a company should not be its founder. The value of a company should be its resources, its curriculum, its counseling team, the people you actually work with.
And that's not to say that the CEO doesn't matter, right? Because obviously a CEO sets vision. Obviously a CEO helps set culture, right? Sets the standards for hiring, sets the standards for curriculum. And so Joel can go off for a second and Erin and I can talk about what to look for in a CEO for these college counseling companies, because you can tell a lot from what a CEO puts on LinkedIn or what a CEO puts on the blog, what a CEO puts online like this podcast. You can tell a lot about a CEO's priorities as a family navigating this space without falling into the trap of that cult of personality that Joel's talking about.
I think that is fair.
Joel says, okay.
I like to think I have some impact. Yeah. But no, I think this is another thing that kind of goes back to, it's not just a company problem, it's a consumer problem. Because I think that a lot of the families I talk to, they sign up because they've spoken to me. Maybe that gives you faith that the company is trustworthy and it's run honestly. And I get all of that. But the reality is that the real value is going to be provided by the resources, the opportunities we have for students, the counseling team, the education team. These cult of personality companies, there's always like a scammy element to them. It's like I charge some preposterously high rate to work with me, and then I secretly hire people behind me that you never know about that do most of the work. There's several famous companies, not actually in the United States, that do this, and it's wild. It's basically a scam.
Then I think it's time for us to talk about the scam. I think it's time for us to talk about marketing.
Yeah.
You guys know that the way that these companies market themselves is wild, and it is the Wild West out there when it comes to numbers. It's crazy how they blow up case studies to try to lure families in. What are some of the things that bug you the most about the way that our competitors market themselves?
Ingenious has not exactly been an aggressive marketing machine. Most of our families come by way of referral from alumni, happy families, business partners, et cetera. Marketing has not exactly been the primary mode of growth. I think that there's probably 2 things. There's a new kind of breed of company in the space. They're usually backed by venture capital, which incidentally, I do not think is an appropriate investment vehicle for this industry because it requires rapid scalability, which is fundamentally not possible, at least not today in this industry. There's a real mismatch there with venture funding and stuff. But what they do is they do really aggressive direct-to-consumer marketing. They're all over Google Ads. These are almost all, if not all, from what I can tell, companies that have a much lower quality service, cannot generate interest from families through referrals. And the reason that I know that is that we've tried a lot of direct-to-consumer marketing. We've tried like Google Ads and Facebook ads and things like that. And what we found was that it was viable at a small scale. But once you started scaling up significantly, you're talking about spending, let's call it $10,000 to $50,000 a month. It becomes extremely unprofitable. Basically, the cost of acquiring new families is too high. The only reason that a company would continue doing that is because they need to show revenue growth, even if it's unprofitable. So to my knowledge, the companies that spend the most in direct-to-consumer marketing, not only are most of them, with one obvious exception, much, much smaller companies than it seems, but they're also unprofitable companies, which is a problem if you're signing up for a multi-year service, because it's entirely possible that 2 years from now they're gone. The other is just like the way the companies market results is just so meaningless to me. I think I said this before, but it's, you have these companies that just say, we got like 100 students into Ivy Leagues, or we do too, by the way. Like we definitely have that statistic. I just don't think it's useful at all, because you don't know how many students we worked with and you don't know what they looked like beforehand. I'll go on record saying that I believe we were the first to look at this in terms of maximization of probability. Like how much more likely is a student to get into a target school working with you versus not? And we do that by basically buying up application data from students that didn't work with us and running a comparison. But like even recently, our number one competitor, which is one of the biggest companies, if not the biggest in the space, they published an article. They didn't name us, but they published it. It was a graphic. They didn't name us, but they're like, here are the results of our nearest competitor. And they had their results, just numbers like Harvard, this many students, Stanford, this many students, Princeton, and then ours. And our numbers were lower. And they said, look, we are 2 times as good as this nearest competitor. What they didn't mention is that they had literally 10 times the number of applicants that year, which actually means that what they were proving was that they are 5 times worse in terms of just like, in terms of the frequency and probability of success. Now, in that case, I would describe that as disingenuous and deliberately. That's not a mistake. That's deliberately misleading. But stuff like that exists. And so I think that families ultimately need to look for things like, you should have the multiple, like how much more likely are you to get in? Okay. You also need to know how many students are applying, and you need to see what schools they got into. You need the raw data, and you need both. You can't have one and not the other. And the last thing I would say is, and this is the hardest part from a family's perspective, because it takes a lot of time, is you need to see detailed case studies. Like this company says, we can get you into this elite school. Okay, show me exactly what you've done in the past to get in. I want like a 30-page case study showing me step-by-step what you did with a student. There's a real selection bias problem in the industry. There's a selection bias with every company, including ours, which is with our results. Is it the case that the students that work with us are more ambitious, come from more driven families? Probably. We can't control for that. So there's always an element of selection bias, but you can limit it, or at least you can control as much as possible for it by basically saying, okay, let's look at students who didn't work with the company that have the same or similar grades and test scores. It's not perfect. You can publish that in a scientific journal, but it's a lot better than just saying 20% of our kids got into Ivy League schools, when it's like you worked with 3 kids and like one of them got into half an Ivy, or whatever the case might be.
It is slick, right? It needs to give you pause, because it means that their hiring has skewed towards their marketing department. It means that they are spending so much of their time and resources and effort into making themselves look that good that you as an outsider can see it. And that's not to say that like we don't care about those things at Ingenious. Of course we do. But I know that it's a lean team running the ship. And I have a lot of appreciation and admiration for that lean team running the ship, because they know what they're doing. They know how to get the information out there. But at the same time, we're not running the really slick ad campaigns that I'm seeing from our competitors. If it looks too good to be true, it probably is. And that's true not just for college counseling, but for a lot of different industries.
To that point, I can say the following. As a company, we have about 350 employees. We're not dummies. We have a big budget. If that kind of aggressive, slick ad campaigns were effective in the sense that they were sustainable, we do them. The point is that they're not. And it's usually a sign that a company needs to keep acquiring families, even if it's unprofitable to do that, which usually has something to do with like their funding cycle, whether they're showing revenue growth. The problem is that once you get big enough, if you haven't been able to develop a really high quality service that can produce additional families just from its quality and through referrals, what you end up with is you're trapped in a cycle of unprofitability. And that's bad. Families don't often think, let me think about the profitability of the admissions consulting company I'm working with. But it's really common these days to sign up in 7th, 8th, 9th grade. You do not want to work with a company that might have to fire 50% of its staff or go bankrupt. And most of these companies that explode out of nowhere, they do go bankrupt. We've seen like time and again, these companies blow up, get huge, implode. It's like clockwork. So I think that the stability of the company that you're working with is important. That said, nobody is ever going to honestly answer the question, are you profitable? They might say, I can't answer that, but no company is going to be like, nope, we're losing money by the fistful. They probably won't do that.
We definitely take some pride in, right? The fact that we started Ingenious with $5,000 of your bar mitzvah money, Joel, and have really built the company organically and through our network of people and providing value and through referrals, through trustworthy relationships with business partners. And that's how we've been able to grow. If we are not able to provide that kind of value, we wouldn't be here 10 years later.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that the bootstrap approach was incredibly painful, but is ultimately good to building like a stable enterprise. So yeah, I know that it's obviously a very big point of pride for us, but I'm sure there are other ways to do it, but I don't think the venture route is a particularly good one. Since we started doing our claims are you're 8 times as likely to get into top 10 or top 20 and 7 times as likely to get into a top 30. This is data that we are happy to share and show how we came up with it. Also, just a kind of shameless plug, my favorite statistic is that students going to public school and working with us are about twice as likely to get into elite schools as the graduates of Exeter and Andover. But there's these companies out there that are saying things like, we give students a 15 times increase in their probability, 20 times increase, which if I'm not mistaken, that means that like at a school like University of Michigan, your probability of success would be like over 350%, which seems dubious.
You're going.
Yeah, it feels like a lot.
You're going for grad school, you're going for med school, you're going for all of it.
Without any circumstance, criteria.
I think that it just requires a certain amount of like credulity or incredulity, actually, of parents, which is just like, if a number is just so outrageously high, there's probably an issue with it. The reality is, like we have populations of students who start with us early who are like 10 times as likely to get in, but they're starting with us in like 8th and 9th grade. That is as high as I've ever seen it. And I think if a company makes those claims, if we make those claims, if you come to us and we make those claims, I would request to see some proof. I think we publish it, but like, how many students did you work with? How many students applied to these schools and got in, et cetera? That's important. It's hard for them to manufacture a lot of fake data. So if you ask for it and they can't provide it, probably because it doesn't exist. And if you ask for it and there's like big problems with it, it's because they're lying. But ask for it.
For sure. I think that in general, numbers are seductive. I have a 1-year-old. I have a few years to go before I am finding a college counseling firm for my little one. But I get it. I understand that you want the best for your child and you want the highest number for your child. Joel, what do you think is the number cutoff that parents need to be like, oh, so if it's above 8, if it's above 9, if it's above 10, like what is the number that they need to be like, oh, that's fake?
In theory, I think if you start before 7th grade for college counseling, they're selling you things you don't need. If you're starting as early in middle school, you're not doing college prep those first 2 years. You're really doing like soft skill development and interest exploration. And I think that's very valuable. But to be clear, that's not the same thing as college prep. In an ideal world, people would sign up in 8th or 9th grade. Generally speaking, the longer the service, the more expensive. There are limitations on that. There is a big difference between starting in 10th and starting in 11th, with 10th being meaningfully better. That's the sort of biggest difference between 2 years is between 10th and 11th. But yeah, earlier is better up to a point. Companies that are like, started when you're 5th grade. I've seen companies proposing like 4th graders. What are you doing? There's nothing you can do that is meaningful for college admissions at this stage. In terms of the cutoff for like the multiple, it's hard to say. I think that anything that is over 10 would be very suspicious for me. Like the only time I've seen that is with companies that do like a ton of direct-to-consumer marketing. They're clearly just looking around at other companies and just like, I'm going to put a number that's higher because nobody can prove it. I think also if you look at the data that they provide, there's often a lot of asterisks. One of our kind of major competitors, they put this table of you're this much more likely to get into MIT and this much more likely to get into Princeton, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there's an asterisk, and the asterisk goes all the way down to the bottom of the page in tiny little text, which basically says, chose a sample specifically from like elite private schools in New York. It wasn't a global sample. They weren't including their kids from like Vietnam and China. They were just taking this like incredibly elite sample. But yeah, I would say be skeptical of all of it. If the number is meaningfully lower than the competitors, there's one competitor who's very famous. They have this on their website and they're advertising like 4 times improvement in probability. Chances are that's honest because it's much lower than other companies. But even us, I would say the way to approach it is like, can you demonstrate to me that this is the case? How are you actually calculating this? And I would say, yeah, pretty much anything from us and above is probably, let's treat it with some level of skepticism.
Obviously, it's something I think Ingenious is doing well, but it's something I hope that parents think about. And I'd love to know, Joel and Aaron, what you think about this situation. In this space, especially in the direct marketing, I see so much about college prestige and and it being prioritized over student well-being. At Ingenious, how do we handle those conversations? I know how I handle those conversations with my direct students right now, but in marketing and when you're leading presentations with parents, how do you talk about prestige over like what the child actually needs or what would be a good fit?
Aaron, that's probably you to start.
That's a great question. Going back to the roots, why parents want these prestige or the prestigious university for their students. Because at the end of the day, what they want is that the student is able to lead a good life after college, have the skills they need to thrive and do well. I think that's everybody's goal. That's their kids' goal too, and also our goal. So when it's time to think about all that, it's really important to keep the child's interests in mind. I have examples of our own students where they joined us in second half of 8th grade. And I remember when they joined us, they said their dream program was the biomedical engineering program at Johns Hopkins University, which is like the most selective biomedical engineering program ever. And also the hardest major to get in at Johns Hopkins, and not one you can transfer into, unlike all the other majors at Hopkins. So for those years, he kept coming back to this idea, and he did other things that were more strategic, potentially you could argue for admissions purposes, more environmentally leaning opportunities. When he had those opportunities come up, we advised that he could try them and do that. But by the time it's applying, right, like he didn't get his parents' support to apply to Johns Hopkins biomedical engineering or decision one. He didn't even get the support to apply early decision two. And so we were super nervous for him because we just know that RD chances are much lower, right? They've admitted probably 60, 70, maybe even 80% of the class by early decision two. There's only 20% of the freshman class left over, and probably not even that percent at a biomedical engineering major. So we were really nervous for him. But ultimately, he got in despite the odds, because that's where his heart was at. And you can imagine how he performed in those interviews would probably be very different from how he performed at other schools' alumni interviews, because that is where the student wanted to be. And that kind of genuineness is what admissions officers are always looking for from a student's file. They really wanted to know, and they want to hear that from the student directly. And I think that sort of stories may be helpful for other parents to think about. The thing that you can trust us on doing is that sometimes families are worried if we're saying you can just find the school that's the best fit for you, it means that we're lowering the bar. But that's actually not the case. What we're talking about is striving for your own excellence and your best self. If that means a certain type of school or certain one school that's better fit for you because that's the kind of excellence that they value, or that's the kind of environment where you can reach your excellence, then that's the school you should be at, and not a different environment where you are going to be stifled and you can't be your best self. I think that's an idea that every parent can get on board with. We all want our kids to be the best version of themselves. And that is also the same goals that we have at Ingenious for all the students we work with.
And to add to that a bit, I think that why do parents and students, why do they care about ranking and prestige? They care about it because it's a proxy for something. And it's an imperfect proxy. The way that these rankings are calculated, they include a whole bunch of variables that you do not care about. Average teacher salaries is one of them. Is that really something that drives your decision about what's the best? Quality of undergraduate education, that one sounds important. But like the overall rankings are an imperfect proxy for a whole variety of things. And I think that for families, what it boils down to is this industry is called admissions consulting, or it's called college counseling. And it's really not either of those things, because the goals for families doesn't end with college. Nobody's thinking, oh, you go to this college and then you're done for life. No. What do you do after? Do you go to grad school? Do you get a job? Is it a good job? Are you happy? Can you support yourself? So it's like properly looked at, like this industry should be helping students not just get into good schools, but also set up a good life. And so that sort of comes into the idea of fit. I think that the concept of fit is poorly understood. I think at this point, everybody understands that fit encompasses things that are like environmental and social, whether the student is going to be happy. And that matters. Just from a statistical standpoint, it is the number one correlative factor in a student's academic success at school is if they're happy. That's number one. So just the science is on the side of student be happy. The second is academic or intellectual fit. A lot of families are like, oh, I love Yale, I love Brown, et cetera, or Dartmouth. These are all excellent schools, but the reality is that if you want to do mechanical engineering, Georgia Tech is probably better for you. UIUC is probably better for you. Now, there's caveats to that, and there are different scenarios in which I would recommend that and scenarios in which I wouldn't. But the point is that whether or not this school can support you intellectually in the specific area that you're interested in is very important. That's, I would say, partially understood. Now, the part that is not understood at all, or at least is never properly considered, is fit for your future. Basically, is it the proper platform for the life that you want to lead? And the reason that it isn't poorly understood is that people assume that the higher the prestige, the more likely it is that the school will be able to enable the life that you wish to lead in the future. That's not true. So students who are like, I want to be in finance, I want to go to Wall Street, my dream school is UCLA. No, your dream school is probably in New York or in Boston, because that's where all the firms are. Here are the schools where all the Wall Street firms recruit on campus. That's actually important. And so it's very important that a school set a student up for lifelong success. And I think that if you align fit in terms of social environmental, fit in terms of intellectual, and fit in terms of, let's call it, future plans, the need to be looking at very imperfect rankings dissipates. Because if I could tell you that if your student goes to Binghamton, they will have the perfect life thereafter, or they can go to Amherst and struggle in their career for the rest of their lives. Presumably, you would say go to Binghamton. So it really does matter how the school sets them up for life. Now, just to be fair and transparent, it does tend to be the case that the schools that set them up best for life do tend to be more competitive overall. Like, it would be nonsense if I said that wasn't true. But it is always true in the way that you think it is. So in any event, in terms of the adult agenda, I think that if parents get behind that vision of what fit means, then basically all of the disagreements tend to dissipate. I think that's extremely important and ultimately gives everyone what they want, which is the student's success, not just in college, but well beyond.
One of my hopes for parents who are listening to this podcast is for them to open up their minds when it comes to what prestigious even means. I'm not just talking Ivies and UIBs here, top 30. But I do think that, Joel, this point that you talked about when it comes to UIUC for engineering or Georgia Tech, there are so many wonderful schools out there that may not have the slick marketing campaigns we were talking about earlier. They may not have reached, like you, the parent listening to this podcast. That doesn't mean it isn't an incredible institution in its own right or for that specific major. So if you're working with Ingenious or if you're working with another college counseling firm, please do trust expert opinions when it comes to this space, because they're not going to lead you wrong. I hope they're not going to lead you wrong, I guess is the better way to say it.
Any other major points that you think are important in terms of selecting a company, choosing a good one, identifying a bad one, any of that?
As a former educator, I think if they don't have clear training expertise in the area, they are not worth your money. And I said this earlier, but use whatever standard you would use when evaluating a school for your child. Use that same test for your admissions firm. If they are not engaging in regular training, ongoing training for their counselors, don't sign up. If they can't produce curricular documents, don't sign up. If the advisors that you're working with don't have meaningful classroom or meaningful admissions experience on their resume, don't sign up. It's about choosing a firm with dedicated professionals who are trained in this space. If they cannot demonstrate that to you beyond, oh, this person went to Northwestern or this person went to Harvard, they're not worth your time.
I would say also maybe try to talk to some students and families too about their experiences if possible. You can always get more insights from them. Companies that are very honest, they will have families that will also tell you their honest experiences, and nobody's going to be perfect. So I think if you get a testimonial that is like, there was nothing wrong, I was happy 100% of the time, obviously you should be suspicious of that too. But I think of having some real conversations and asking questions about, in those kind of situations, what happened? How did the company or their counselors support you in those instances? I think can be a helpful way to as well understand what it's like to work with that company, so that you get some other people who have had firsthand experience.
I'd say probably two things. One of them is the best and really only way to reliably get students into really elite schools is to make them deserving of getting in. The whole idea of hacking your way into these schools is nonsense. It does not work. And if it works once, it doesn't work twice. And so that being said, the best companies are the ones that are actually education companies. They're not agents. They're not like hacking your way in. They're explaining to you how they can make a student deserving of getting in. And that is done through investment in soft and hard skills, academic skills, their passions and interests, their extracurricular activities. A student should actually deserve the end goal. Another way of putting that is that these services, even if you don't get into the school you want to, should have been worth a lot. You should have learned a ton. A student should be much better for it. If you get this sense that's not the case, you're probably dealing with a company that is more motivated financially than they are to help students. The second one is, and I think we didn't really touch on this, but I think it's worth talking about it. There's constant tension between small and big companies in this space, and families have wildly diverging opinions on what they're looking for. Fundamentally, a great service in this industry is comprised of two things. One is really thorough strategy from somebody who really understands the admissions office, understands the student, understands how to build on a passion or interest over time. That's number one. Number two is the resources to execute on that strategy. Internships, research opportunities, entrepreneurial opportunities, summer programs, tutoring, test prep, all these other things. The advantage of a small company is it's very intimate, right? You're pretty sure that you're not just going to be a number. In most cases, you probably get some quality strategic advice, assuming that the person is qualified or the people are qualified, but you don't have access to any of the resources. I think that's a real problem. If they cost way less, that would probably be why, and they should, because without those resources, you're getting less than 50% of the value. Then you have big companies. And so we're definitely in this category. Companies with, let's call it like more than 100 employees. There aren't that many of them in this space. Your concern at that point is, how do they ensure that my student gets like adequate personalized attention? How do we make sure that my student doesn't fall through the cracks, that like deadlines are followed, et cetera? You shouldn't have to be particularly concerned with a company that size about resources. Basically, if a company of that size can't snap their fingers and give you all of the resources that you need to in order to achieve your objectives, then it's not a good company. So you need to have an answer to that question. So it's like in Ingenious, there's like a whole bunch of stuff. We have an absolute mountain of proprietary intellectual property. It's hundreds of thousands of pages of curriculum that counselors and students are working through. We have our own software platform that automates a lot of follow-ups and allows us to supervise students very closely and very quickly. We have a lot of intermediate management supervising counselors. We have senior counselors who do spot check work. There's a whole process of ensuring that every student is getting great service. But that's what you're choosing between. You're choosing either risking not having the resources, or you're choosing risking the service being inconsistent at scale. Because most companies, when they get to our size or larger, they're just middlemen. They're just finding a student, finding a counselor, pairing them up and hoping for the best. They're not managing those people actively, whether they say they are or not. So you get wildly divergent experiences for students, and you don't want that either. The kind of major takeaways: this can be a very difficult industry for families to discern good companies from bad. There are a lot of reasons that is the case, perhaps the largest of which is that it's very hard to prove if a company has actually added value or if they haven't. There are some things to look for in a good company. Generally speaking, they will have admissions officers on staff. Ideally, you get to work directly with one, but not having any admissions officers is usually a red flag that they don't necessarily understand the admissions process as well as they can. You don't need to work with 10 of them, but it's useful if the team has a lot of admissions officers, because that means that the company has been able to compile a lot of insight from a lot of different schools. There aren't that many companies that have like more than 10 admissions officers. In general, you want to have a variety. The companies need to have the resources to execute on a strategy. If they are like, these are the things you need to do in order to be a very competitive student, if they can't guarantee those, and I truly guarantee, not like I have a friend who's a professor who could probably supervise this, but like literally contracts with people that they can call upon at the drop of a hat to execute on the strategy, you are not going to get your money's worth, right? You're going to get mentorship, which can be very valuable, but without the execution, it's not worth half of the service. In general, the companies that are good will have a lot of full-time counselors and salaried counselors. They will not use college students. That's like a big no-no, big red flag. They will not be purely contractors. They will not have an assembly line process where there's 5 to 10 different people involved in the process. That is almost always a bad sign, evidence that they're trying to hide how frequently people are rolling over, quitting, getting fired, et cetera. The companies that are good, generally speaking, have results that are demonstrated to you in several ways. One of them will be, here's how much more likely you are to succeed if you work with us. That's important. In order for it to be important, you also need the raw data, which is here's how many students that we worked with, and here's the schools that they got into. You need both that information and the multiplier to make sure that it all checks out. And then the last thing is, and I think families should always ask for this, is ask for a couple of case studies. Sometimes families ask for ridiculous things. I want a case study from a student, from my student's grade who was born in this country but goes to this specific school. That's not going to help you make a decision. But what you want is to see case studies that actually prove that the company can take a student who starts and would not get into their dream school and ends and they would, and can explain very specifically what the company did to achieve that. Our case studies, some of them are 40, 50 pages long. That's actually how long it takes to show all of the things that you need to do for a good service. But I strongly recommend that families ask for them. Other than that, there's a whole bunch of other kind of small things, companies that make guarantees. Any company that says we have special connections to a school is lying. Firstly, because if you have special connections to a school, you would never tell people. There's no chance that happens. And secondly, and I tell all of the families this, I come from a very academic family. Everyone in my family went to Cornell and Harvard Medical School and Dartmouth and whatever. And a lot of them have served in administrative roles at different institutions. I'm here to tell you that if I do not have useful connections to hack a student's way into a school, they don't either. Unless you have a really good reason to believe that this person, usually they are in like foreign country, has a real inroad to Yale, the chances are that they don't. That's pretty much it. I guess the last thing I would just say is make sure that you're hiring education companies, not agents. If you get the sense that this is a company that is capable of making your student actually better and deserving of going to these schools, that's the company you want to be with. This was, I think, a very productive first stab at the podcast. I want to thank Aaron and Lindsay very much for joining me. And thanks, everybody. We'll be putting out a podcast probably on a weekly cadence going forward. Hopefully, I'll be able to keep some of them shorter, but unlikely. Anyway, I wish you all the best and talk soon.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.